Hey guys, tonight, let's do something very ambitious and extremely relaxing. Let's go back to medieval life. Not the sword-swinging, castle-seeking version. The other one. The slow one. The one where most people spent their entire existence ankle-deep in mud, doing the same job every day and calling it a lifetime. So dim the lights. Put your phone down somewhere safe. Let your brain power down to about 10%. You won't need the rest. We're just going to drift through the medieval world at a walking pace, possibly slower. Nobody was in a rush anyway. Medieval life was not designed for excitement. It was designed for survival, repetition, and the quiet hope that this year's harvest wouldn't absolutely ruin everyone. And for most people, that was enough. There were no notifications. No schedules more complicated than sunrise, sunset, and church bells. If you wanted to know what time it was, you guessed. And if you were wrong, nobody cared. Time was a suggestion. Let's start with the jobs. Because medieval life was basically one long job interview with God, and nobody ever got promoted. Most people were peasants, not the romantic kind. The kind that woke up tired and went to sleep tired. A peasant's job was farming, even if they technically had another job. Blacksmith? Still farmed? Miller? Farmed. Innkeeper? Definitely farmed. Farming was the default setting. If you didn't farm, you were either very rich, very sick, or very dead. A medieval peasant woke up before dawn, mostly because the sun told them to. Beds were simple. Straw mattresses, wooden frames. Sometimes just a pile of hay that everyone agreed was a bed. The house was usually one room. People slept together. Parents, children, possibly a goat. Privacy was not a concept yet. If you wanted alone time, you went outside and stared at a field. Breakfast was not exciting. Bread, maybe cheese if things were going well. Ale was common, even in the morning, because water was unreliable and medieval plumbing was optimistic at best. Ale was weak though. Think less drunk and more hydrated but sad. Then came the work. Fields needed constant attention. Plowing with wooden tools. Harvesting by hand. Weeding forever. The soil was heavy. The tools were crude. Blisters were permanent residents. And the work never ended. Because nature does not care if you're tired. If the weather was bad, that was your problem. If the weather was good, that was also your problem, because now you had more work. And hovering over all of this was the local lord. The person who technically owned the land, your house, and possibly your soul. Peasants didn't work just for themselves. They worked for the lord. They owed labor, taxes, portions of their crops. Sometimes extra gifts, which were not gifts. They were threats with better branding. But let's slide gently away from the fields for a moment and float toward the towns. Medieval towns were small, cramped, and smelled exactly like what you think they smelled like. No sewage systems. Waste went into streets, rivers, or conveniently forgotten corners. People adapted. You had to. If you didn't adapt, you moved, or you died. Medieval solutions were efficient in that way. Town life meant specialization. This is where jobs started getting interesting, but only a little. Bakers baked. Butchers butchered. Tanners worked with animal hides, which meant they worked with urine and rotting flesh, which meant nobody wanted to live near them. Medieval zoning laws were basically social vibes. Craftsmen worked long hours, usually in small workshops attached to their homes. Apprentices lived with their masters, worked for years, and were paid mostly in food and experience. And by experience, we mean exhaustion and the vague hope of one day owning your own tools. Guilds controlled everything. Prices, quality, who could work, who could sell. Guilds were like medieval HR departments, but with more power and less paperwork. If you angered your guild, your career was over. You might as well go back to farming, or pretending to farm. Merchants were a slightly different breed. They traveled. They took risks. They moved goods between towns and regions. Cloth, spices, grain, wine. Merchants knew roads. inns, which bridges were safe, which towns charged unreasonable tolls. They were exposed to danger constantly, but they also had stories. And medieval people loved stories, because entertainment options were limited. Which brings us to inns. Medieval inns were not cozy fantasy taverns with fireplaces and charming hosts. They were loud, crowded, and chaotic. You shared rooms. You shared beds. If you were lucky, you shared with someone who didn't snore or steal. If you were unlucky, you shared with both. Inns were hubs of gossip. News traveled slowly, but inns sped it up. Wars, marriages, deaths, rumors. Everything passed through an inn eventually. And since literacy was rare, everything was oral. Information mutated. A minor skirmish became a massacre. A noble's cough became a deathbed confession. Accuracy was flexible. Food at inns was filling, not refined. Stews, bread, whatever was available. Meat if you were lucky. Freshness was negotiable. Spices were used generously, partly for flavor, partly for camouflage. And everyone pretended not to notice. Now let's drift back out of town and into the quieter rhythms again. Rural life followed the seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer meant maintenance. Autumn meant harvest. Winter meant survival and boredom. Winter was hard. Food ran low. Work slowed. People stayed indoors. Illness spread. Fires were dangerous but necessary. Nights were long. Stories filled the time. Church bells marked everything. Time, events, life milestones. Religion was woven into daily existence. Not as a philosophical exercise, but as a framework. Life was hard, unfair, and unpredictable. Religion explained that, or at least gave it structure. Heaven was promised later. Right now, there was work to do. Medieval people were not ignorant in the way we often imagine. They knew their world, their land, their animals, their tools. They just didn't know things far away, because far away might as well have been the moon. Travel was slow, dangerous, expensive. Most people died within a few miles of where they were born. Not out of tragedy, just inertia. Children worked early. Very early. Childhood was short. By 7 or 8, kids were useful. Carrying water, herding animals, helping in workshops. Education, when it existed, was practical. Skills passed down through observation and repetition. Reading was rare. Writing even rarer. Memory did the heavy lifting, and yet there was humor. Dry humor. Gallows humor. Jokes about the Lord. Jokes about the weather. Jokes about how this year was definitely worse than last year. Laughter was quiet and shared. It didn't fix anything, but it made the work lighter for a moment. Life expectancy was low, but that number is misleading. Many people lived into their 50s or 60s if they survived childhood. Death was familiar, not dramatic, just present. Funerals were common. Mourning was short. The field still needed tending. As night fell, candles were lit sparingly. Light was precious. People went to sleep early. The dark was deep. Silence settled in, broken only by animals' wind and the occasional distant bell. Tomorrow would be much like today. And that was the point. Medieval life was not about progress. It was about continuity. Doing what had always been done. Passing it on. Surviving just enough to do it again. And in that repetition, there was a strange kind of peace. So let's rest here for a moment. In the soft darkness of a medieval night, no plans. No alarms. Just the slow breathing of a world that didn't expect much, and somehow kept going anyway. Alright, let's keep drifting. Same pace, nothing sudden. The medieval world is very patient, and it expects you to be too. If part 1 was the quiet breathing of the countryside, part 2 is the soft hum of people trying to trade cabbages for shoes, and pretending this is a normal way to live. Markets were the highlight of the medieval week, sometimes the only highlight. Market day meant color, noise, and mild chaos. It meant you might see someone you hadn't seen in months, even if they only lived 3 villages away. which tells you everything you need to know about medieval travel habits. Markets usually took place in town squares or open fields. Stalls were simple: wooden tables, cloth covers, nothing fancy. Merchants shouted their prices because subtle marketing had not yet been invented. Everything was loud, but not exciting, just insistent. You could buy grain, vegetables, eggs, cheese, wool, tools, and sometimes things that felt almost luxurious. Dried fruit, spices, maybe imported cloth if you were feeling ambitious and financially reckless. Coins were used, but barter was common. And prices were flexible in the way that depended heavily on your face, your accent, and how desperate the seller was. Haggling was expected. If you paid the first price, people assumed you were either wealthy or confused. Probably both. Disputes were settled loudly, sometimes with witnesses, sometimes with insults, occasionally with fists, but not as often as you'd think. Broken bones were inconvenient when your entire job involved using your body. Markets were also social spaces. News spread here. Gossip thrived. Engagements were announced. Arguments continued from last week. Someone was always angry about the price of bread. And someone else was always blaming the baker, even though the baker was just as tired as everyone else. Now let's slide gently toward medieval money. Because money existed, but trust in money was conditional. Coins were often clipped, shaved, debased. Kings loved reducing the silver content while pretending nothing had changed. Merchants noticed. Everyone noticed. Inflation happened quietly, like everything else. This is why scales were everywhere. Coins were weighed, inspected, bitten, sometimes, because apparently that felt reassuring. Counterfeiting existed, but punishment was harsh, so most people stuck to small dishonesty. Just enough to survive. Not enough to lose a hand. Debt was common, very common. People borrowed constantly, from neighbors, from merchants, from the local lord. Debt was not shameful, it was normal. If you didn't owe someone something, you were probably new or lying. And speaking of lying, let's talk about medieval trust. Trust was local. You trusted people you knew. You trusted their families. You trusted people who had reputations. Strangers were optional risks. Hospitality was a virtue, but caution was survival. Which brings us back to travel. Medieval roads were rough, literally and socially. Roads were dirt paths, muddy in rain, dusty in summer. Bridges were rare and often charged tolls. Bandits existed, but they weren't constant. The real danger was injury. A twisted ankle could end a journey. Or a life. Travelers planned carefully. They followed known routes, stayed at known inns, traveled in groups when possible. And they carried letters of introduction, because medieval LinkedIn was just handwritten notes saying, "This person probably won," to steal your stuff. Now let's pause for a moment inside one of those inns again, but later at night. The fire is low. People are quieter. Someone is snoring aggressively. A merchant is counting coins by candlelight. An innkeeper is pretending not to notice a guest who clearly can't pay. Inns were businesses, but they were also shelters. And innkeepers had to balance kindness with survival. Too generous, and you went broke. Too strict, and your reputation suffered. Reputation mattered more than advertising. Word traveled. Slowly, but relentlessly. Stories filled the evenings. Tales of saints. Tales of kings. Tales of monsters that absolutely existed. Trust me. Stories didn't need to be true. They needed to be repeatable, and maybe comforting, or at least distracting. Now let's drift into medieval homes again, not castles. We'll get to those later. For now, think small. Think practical. Houses were built with local materials: wood, wattle, and daub. Stone if you were lucky or wealthy. Roofs were thatched. Fire was a constant risk. Entire towns burned down more than once. People rebuilt, again and again. Furniture was minimal. A table, benches, chests for storage. Beds if you were doing well. Everything had multiple uses. Space was precious. Decoration was rare, but not non-existent. Religious images, simple carvings, symbols of protection. People liked feeling protected. Hygiene existed, just differently. Bathing happened, but not daily. Water had to be fetched, heated, managed. People washed when necessary. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, especially earlier in the medieval period. Later, they declined, partly due to disease fears, partly due to moral panic. Because, of course, clothing was functional. Wool dominated. Linen for undergarments. Colors depended on dyes, which depended on plants, insects, and expense. Bright colors meant money. Most people wore muted tones, browns, grays, faded blues. Clothes were repaired endlessly. Fabric was valuable. Nothing was thrown away casually. Now let's talk about food again, because medieval people thought about food constantly. Not because they loved it, but because they worried about it. Diets were repetitive. Bread was the foundation. Everything else was optional. Seasonal vegetables, occasionally meat. Fish on religious days, which were many. Very many. The church regulated diets heavily. Fasting days, feast days. Rules layered on rules. People followed them unevenly. Some were strict. Some were creative. Loopholes were discovered. Fish classifications got very imaginative, because apparently beavers counted as fish in some places. Medieval logic was flexible when hunger was involved. Alcohol was everywhere. Ale, wine, cider. Beer was safer than water in many cases. Drunkenness existed, but constant intoxication was rare. Alcohol was part of daily life, not an escape. You drank because it was there, not because you wanted to forget everything. There wasn't time for that. Now let's gently acknowledge sickness. Disease was common. Explanations were limited. Treatments were hopeful. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, prayers. Doctors existed, but access was limited. Most care happened at home. People accepted illness as part of life. Recovery was celebrated quietly. Death was expected. Despite this, people married, loved, argued, had children, lived full emotional lives within narrow physical boundaries. Romance existed, but practicality dominated. Marriage was about survival, partnerships, labor. Affection came later, if at all. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Expectations were low. Festivals broke the routine. Religious holidays. Seasonal celebrations. Music, dancing, drinking. Temporary joy. Authorities tolerated them cautiously. Too much happiness made people suspicious. But some release was necessary. Even medieval systems understood that. And then, after the festival, it was back to work. Always back to work. The fields didn't care about your hangover. The animals still needed feeding. The rhythm resumed. Steady. Predictable. Almost soothing in its inevitability. Medieval life was not exciting, but it was textured, layered, dense with small moments. And as we continue, we'll slowly drift upward. Toward castles. Toward elites. Toward people who technically had easier lives, and somehow managed to make them much worse. But not yet. For now, stay here. In the market dust. In the candlelight. In the soft exhaustion of people who didn't expect miracles. Only tomorrow. And tomorrow, inconveniently, always arrived. Now let's drift over to merchants, because not everyone in medieval times stayed in one place their whole life. Some people actually traveled, and they did it for business, and their lives were a different kind of exhausting. Market day was a big deal in medieval villages and towns. Usually once a week, everyone would gather in the market square to buy, sell, and trade. Local farmers would bring their extra produce. Craftspeople would sell their goods. And merchants would show up with items from other places, things you couldn't get locally. These local markets were pretty modest. You'd have stalls set up, maybe just boards laid across barrels with people hawking their wares. Eggs, chickens, vegetables, cheese, cloth, tools, pots, whatever people had made or grown. It was loud and crowded and smelled like a combination of animals, unwashed humans, and food in various states of freshness. Everyone was trying to get the best price, which meant a lot of arguing and haggling. Fixed prices weren't really a thing. You negotiated everything. Women did a lot of the selling at local markets. They'd bring butter they'd churned, cheese they'd made, eggs from their chickens, vegetables from their gardens. This was how they contributed to the household income. The money they made was essential for buying things the family couldn't produce themselves, like salt or iron tools or the services of a blacksmith. Salt, by the way, was incredibly important and not cheap. You couldn't refrigerate food, so you preserved it with salt. Meat was salted, fish was salted, vegetables were pickled in brine. Salt was literally a preservative between you and starvation, and it had to be mined or evaporated from seawater, which meant it came from specific places and had to be transported. This made it valuable enough that people sometimes paid taxes or wages in salt, which is where we get the word salary. The merchants who traveled between towns and cities lived a very different life from the village craftspeople. These were people who bought goods in one place and sold them in another, making their profit on the markup. They'd travel in groups for safety because roads were dangerous, full of bandits and thieves who would absolutely rob and murder you for your goods if they got the chance. A traveling merchant might deal in cloth, spices, wine, tools, luxury items like glassware or jewelry. Really anything that could be transported and sold for a profit. The more expensive the goods, the more profit you could make, but also the more risk you took. If your cart got robbed or your goods got ruined by weather, you could lose everything. These merchants would travel along established trade routes, stopping at market towns along the way. Every major town had regular market days, and some had annual fairs that were huge events drawing merchants from all over. Fairs would last for days or even weeks, and they were where you'd find the really good stuff. Imported spices from the east, fine cloth from Flanders, wine from France, furs from the north. It was the closest thing medieval people had to international shopping. The big international merchants, the ones dealing in luxury goods and operating across countries, were basically the medieval equivalent of business executives. They'd have agents in different cities, complex credit arrangements, and detailed knowledge of trade routes and prices. They made serious money, enough to live in nice houses in cities, and wear good clothes, and eat meat regularly. They were often resented by the nobility because they had wealth but not noble blood, and medieval society was very much built on the idea that birth determined your worth. These merchants would join guilds too, merchant guilds that controlled trade in various cities. The guilds would set rules about who could sell what, where you could sell it, what prices were acceptable. They'd also help members who fell on hard times, arrange marriages between merchant families, and generally work to keep outsiders from muscling in on their business. Banking was starting to become a thing in the later medieval period, with Italian merchants leading the way. Because if you're a merchant traveling from England to Italy, you don't want to carry a chest full of gold coins. That's heavy and dangerous and begging to be stolen. Instead, you deposit money with a banker in London, get a letter of credit, travel to Italy, and withdraw your money from a banker there who was part of the same network. They'd charge you fees for this service, obviously, but it was safer than carrying actual coins. Interest on loans was technically illegal because the church said usury was a sin. But people needed loans, and people wanted to make money lending, so they found creative ways around it. You wouldn't charge interest directly. You de-billed it into the exchange rate or charge fees for various services or structure deals in complicated ways that technically weren't usury, but functionally were. Medieval people were excellent at finding loopholes. The roads these merchants traveled on were, let's be honest, pretty terrible. Roman roads still existed in some places and were actually decent since the Romans knew how to build infrastructure. But most medieval roads were just dirt paths that turned to mud when it rained. Carts would get stuck, horses would go lame, travel would slow to a crawl. In winter, things were even worse. In summer, you dealt with heat and dust, and the fact that there was no such thing as air conditioning or even a cold drink. Bandits were a real and constant threat. Forests were especially dangerous because that's where robbers would hide and ambush travelers. Some areas were so notorious for banditry that merchants would hire guards or travel in large armed groups. Of course, this added to the cost of doing business, which meant prices went up, which meant ordinary people could afford even less. Inns started popping up along major trade routes because merchants needed places to sleep. These weren't like modern hotels. They were rough establishments, often just a large room where multiple people would sleep together in shared beds or on the floor. You'd bring your own food or buy whatever the innkeeper was serving, which was usually pretty basic: bread, stew, ale. The innkeeper's life was its own kind of exhausting. You'd provide lodging, food, and stabling for horses. You'd deal with drunk travelers, settle disputes, try to prevent fights. You'd water down the ale to stretch it further and hope no one noticed. You'd change the straw in the beds occasionally and try to keep the rats and fleas to a manageable level. You'd get up before dawn to start the fire and stay up late dealing with the last stragglers who wanted one more drink. Medieval inns had a reputation for being rowdy, dirty, and occasionally dangerous. People got robbed in inns, sometimes by other guests, sometimes by the innkeeper or his staff. There were stories, probably exaggerated, but maybe not entirely fictional, of innkeepers who would murder wealthy guests for their money. Trust was not a given when you checked into a medieval inn. The drink of choice was ale for commoners and wine for the wealthy. Water was often unsafe to drink in towns because medieval sanitation was basically non-existent, and people were dumping their waste into rivers that other people drank from downstream. Ale was safer because the brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed most of the bacteria, even though medieval people didn't know about bacteria. Ale was weak, much weaker than modern beer, so people drank it all day without getting especially drunk. It was basically like drinking liquid bread, which makes sense because it was made from grain. Every household would brew their own ale. Usually the women did this, and it had to be drunk fairly quickly before it went off. There was no refrigeration, and beer without hops, which came later, didn't keep well. Alehouses were common in villages and towns, places where you could buy ale and socialize. They were often just someone's front room with a pole stuck out the window to indicate ale was for sale. You'd sit on benches, drink from wooden or pottery cups, and chat with neighbors or travelers. It was the main form of social entertainment for people who weren't rich enough to throw feasts. Let's move into towns properly now, because towns were different from villages. They were bigger, denser, smellier, and full of people doing specialized jobs that villages couldn't support. If you lived in a medieval town, you were probably a craftsperson, a merchant, or someone who provided services to the people who actually made money. Towns had walls, usually stone walls with gates that closed at night. This was for defense and also for controlling who came in and out, because towns charged tolls on goods entering the town. Those tolls helped pay for maintaining the walls and other town infrastructure. Town guards would man the gates, check carts, collect fees, and generally make sure no one was sneaking in contraband or avoiding their taxes. Being a town guard was probably a mix of boring and occasionally terrifying. Most days nothing happened. You stood at the gate, you checked people's business, you waved them through. But sometimes there was trouble. A fight would break out, someone would try to sneak something past you, or in truly exciting times, an enemy army would show up and you'd have to actually defend the walls. Town guards were usually local men, not professional soldiers, so their effectiveness varied wildly. Inside the walls, towns were cramped. Buildings were built right up against each other, often sharing walls. Streets were narrow, barely wide enough for a cart to pass through in many places. Upper floors of buildings would jut out over the street, creating even less space below and blocking out the sun. It was dark and close, and the smell must have been incredible, and not in a good way. Sanitation in medieval towns was a disaster. There was no sewage system. People would dump their chamber pots out the window into the street, sometimes shouting a warning first, but often not. There would be central gutters or channels meant to carry waste away, but they'd overflow and get clogged and spread disease. Pigs and dogs roamed the streets eating garbage, which was actually helpful since they were basically the only garbage disposal system. Privies, when they existed, were just holes in the ground or wooden seats over cesspits. Some houses had privies that jutted out over the town walls, so waste would fall outside the town, which seemed like a great idea until you remember that people lived outside the walls too. Public latrines existed in some places, usually built over rivers so the waste would flow away. Downstream communities were not thrilled about this. The stench of medieval towns was apparently so bad that wealthy people carried pomanders, little decorative balls filled with spices, and perfumes that they'd hold up to their noses when the smell got too intense. And these were the rich people who could afford to bathe occasionally and wear clean clothes. Imagine being a poor laborer living in one room with 6 other people and no running water. Water was a constant issue. Wells provided drinking water, and towns would have public wells or fountains that people could use. Carrying water was heavy work, usually done by women or children, hauling buckets from the well back to the house multiple times a day for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Some towns had aqueducts, usually left over from Roman times, that brought water in from outside. But most places, you just used a well and hoped it wasn't contaminated by the cesspit next door. Bathing was not a daily thing, or even a weekly thing for most people. It was too much work to heat that much water when you needed every bit of firewood for cooking and staying warm. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, where you could pay to use a large communal tub. These were popular but also seen as morally questionable, because they often doubled as brothels. The church was not a fan of bathhouses for this reason, among others. Laundry was another nightmare task. You'd boil water, add lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat, and then beat the hell out of your clothes to get them clean. It was hard physical labor that took hours, and you couldn't do it often because it wore out the fabric. Clothes were expensive and had to last, so you'd wear things until they were absolutely filthy before washing them. Undergarments got washed more often, but outer garments? Those might go months between washings. The smell of medieval people must have been intense. Body odor, dirty clothes, rotting teeth, and no deodorant. Everyone smelled, so presumably you just got used to it, but still. The rich would use perfumes and sweet-smelling herbs to cover up the worst of it. The poor just smelled and dealt with it. Let's talk about the service industry, because towns had a whole class of people who didn't make things, but instead provided services. Barbers were one example. Barbers didn't just cut hair, they also performed minor surgeries, pulled teeth, and let blood. Bloodletting was a common medical treatment based on the theory that your humors needed balancing, and the way to do that was to drain off some blood. It didn't work, obviously, but medieval medicine was more art than science, and by art I mean complete guesswork. Going to a barber to have a tooth pulled meant sitting in a chair while a man with no anesthetic training and dubious hygiene yanked on your infected tooth with pliers until it came out, hopefully in one piece. Then you de-bleed into a bowl and go home to deal with the pain and hope infection didn't kill you. Dental health was terrible because sugar was rare, but bread was constant, and bread has enough sugar to rot your teeth over time. Plus no one was brushing their teeth effectively, so decay was rampant. Physicians existed, but were expensive and mostly served the wealthy. They'd had some education, usually at a university, where they de-studied ancient texts by Galen and Hippocrates and learned theories about the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was that illness came from an imbalance of these humors, so treatment involved restoring balance through diet, bloodletting, purging, or various herbal remedies. Some of the remedies actually worked because plants contain real medicinal compounds. Willow bark for pain relief, which contains the precursor to aspirin. Chamomile for stomach issues. Peppermint for digestion, but a lot of it was nonsense. drinking powdered gemstones, wearing amulets, astrological timing of treatments. Medieval medicine was a mix of practical knowledge passed down through generations and complete magical thinking. For most people, healthcare meant going to the local wise woman or herbalist, someone who knew which plants could help with what ailment. They'd make poultices and tinctures and give advice that was sometimes helpful and sometimes just old wives' tales. But it was cheap or free, unlike a physician, so that's what you used. Midwives delivered babies, which was the most dangerous thing a medieval woman could do. Childbirth mortality was horrifyingly high. 1 in 3 women died in childbirth at some point in their lives. Babies died even more frequently, with maybe 1 in 3 not surviving to age 5. Midwives did their best, but they were working without any real understanding of infection or anatomy. They had inherited knowledge and experience, and that was it. If the birth went badly, if the baby was breech or the mother was hemorrhaging, there wasn't much a midwife could do. Women would write their wills before going into labor because they knew death was a real possibility. Having multiple children was necessary because you couldn't count on all of them surviving. It was a brutal reality that shaped medieval family life. Wet nurses were employed by wealthy families to breastfeed their babies while the mother recovered, or, more often, got pregnant again as quickly as possible. Wet nurses were women who had recently given birth themselves and had milk to spare, or rather, had milk they were willing to sell instead of giving it to their own baby. This was a weird economic transaction that highlighted the class differences in medieval society. Rich women could pay to avoid the physical toll of nursing, while poor women would nurse other people's babies for money. Servants were everywhere in wealthy households. Cooking, cleaning, serving food, tending fires, running errands. All of this required a small army of people in a time before any labor-saving devices existed. If you were a servant, you'd work from early morning until late at night, doing whatever your master or mistress required. You'd live in the house, sleeping in the kitchen or a shared servant's room, eating the leftover food, wearing handed-down clothes. It wasn't slavery. You were paid a small wage and could theoretically leave if you found a better position. But the working conditions were still pretty grim. Long hours, hard physical labor, no privacy, and you were at the mercy of your employer's temper. Good employers treated servants decently. Bad employers treated them like disposable property. Let's float back to the everyday rhythm of medieval life, because time moved differently then. There were no clocks in most places, or at least not accurate ones. Church bells marked the hours for prayers, and that's how people knew what time it was, roughly. Sunrise meant it was time to wake up and start work. Sunset meant it was getting dark, and you should probably finish up, because working by candlelight was expensive and dangerous. The pace of life was seasonal in a way we don't experience anymore. Spring was planting time, frantic and busy. Summer was weeding and maintaining crops, still busy but slightly less desperate. Autumn was harvest, all hands on deck, everyone working until they collapsed because if you didn't get the crops in, you'd starve. Winter was the slow time, when there wasn't much work to do in the fields and you'd focus on indoor tasks, repairs, crafts, and hoping your food stores lasted until spring. Winter was hard in medieval times. It was cold, and heating your house meant keeping a fire going constantly. Firewood had to be gathered, which was labor-intensive, and you needed a lot of it. Wealthy people had fireplaces in multiple rooms. Poor people had a central hearth, and everyone huddled around it. The smoke would rise up to a hole in the roof. Theoretically, but in practice, houses were constantly smoky, and your eyes burned, and your lungs filled with particulates that definitely shortened your life. Clothes in winter were layered wool, which kept you warm when it was dry, but got heavy and cold when wet. Wool cloaks, wool tunics, wool hose. Everything was wool because sheep were plentiful and wool was warm. Linen undergarments went against your skin because linen was easier to wash and less scratchy. But everything was damp and cold from November to March, and you just had to deal with it. Frostbite was a real risk for people who worked outside. Chilblains, which are painful inflammations of the small blood vessels in your extremities, from repeated exposure to cold, were common. Your hands and feet would be chronically painful in winter, swollen and itchy, and occasionally cracked and bleeding. Fun times. Food preparation was a full-time job for women. Not a side task, a full-time job. Bread had to be made from scratch, which meant grinding grain into flour, mixing dough, kneading it, letting it rise, baking it. This took hours. You'd do this every few days because bread went stale quickly. The pottage pot, which simmered constantly over the fire, had to be tended and stirred and added to. Vegetables had to be chopped. Meat, if you had it, had to be prepared. Cheese had to be made from milk if you had a cow or goat. Making cheese was a whole process. You'd curdle the milk with rennet, which came from the stomach lining of a calf, then drain off the whey and press the curds until they formed a solid mass. Fresh cheese was soft and didn't keep long. Aged cheese was harder, kept better, and tasted stronger. Every household that had access to milk made cheese, because it was a way to preserve the milk and have protein that would last. Butter was made by churning cream, which meant putting cream in a churn, and moving a paddle up and down for what felt like forever until the fat separated from the liquid and formed butter. Your arms would be screaming after an hour of churning, but you needed butter because it was one of the few sources of fat in the diet, and fat was calories, and calories kept you alive. Preservation of food was critical because there was no refrigeration. Everything had to be dried, salted, smoked, or pickled to last. Meat was salted or smoked. Fish was dried or salted. Vegetables were pickled in brine or vinegar. Fruits were dried or made into preserves with honey, though honey was expensive and most people didn't have much of it. In autumn, you'd work frantically to preserve everything you could, because you needed it to last until the next harvest. Root vegetables like turnips and onions could be stored in cool cellars and would last for months. Cabbage could be fermented into something like sauerkraut. Apples could be stored if you kept them cool and dry. But a lot of food spoiled anyway, and you'd eat it on the edge of spoilage because you couldn't afford to waste anything. The church was absolutely central to medieval life in a way that's hard to overstate. Everyone was Catholic, unless you were Jewish or Muslim living in a Christian kingdom, and even then you were affected by Christian rules and holidays. The church calendar structured the year. Sundays were rest days, theoretically, though work still had to be done. Saints' days were scattered throughout the year, maybe 100 of them, and they were holidays when you weren't supposed to work. This sounds great until you realize that not working meant not earning, and most people couldn't afford to take 100 days off. But you were expected to go to church on these holy days, and you'd be noticed if you didn't show up. The priest would definitely notice. Your neighbors would notice. Medieval society was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and social pressure was intense. Church services were in Latin, which most people didn't understand. The priest would perform the Mass, reciting prayers and conducting rituals that were mysterious and sacred to the illiterate congregation. You'd stand. There were no pews for common people. You'd stand for an hour or more while the priest did his thing. The church building was probably the nicest building in town, made of stone with windows and decorations that your house definitely didn't have. The priest himself was theoretically celibate, though this rule was often broken. Priests were supposed to be educated, at least enough to read Latin and perform the services. But in small villages, the priest might be barely literate and not much better educated than his flock. He'd live in a modest house near the church, supported by tithes and church lands. His job was to perform services, hear confessions, give blessings, and generally oversee the spiritual life of the community. Confession was mandatory at least once a year, usually around Easter. You'd tell the priest your sins, he'd assign penance, usually prayers or fasting or a donation to the church, and you'd be absolved. The priest knew everyone's secrets, which gave him significant social power. He could shame you from the pulpit if you wanted to, though subtly without naming names, just describing sins that everyone would know were yours. Marriage was a church sacrament, though in practice, many people just got married by declaring their intent in front of witnesses. The church wanted to control marriage and make it official, but in rural areas, informal marriages were common. You'd promise to marry someone, maybe exchange gifts, consummate the relationship, and boom, you were married. The church tried to crack down on this and require formal ceremonies, but it was an ongoing struggle. Most people got married in their 20s, later than you might think. Women around 20 to 25, men around 25 to 30. This was because you needed to be economically stable enough to support a family. Men needed to finish their apprenticeships and establish themselves in a trade. Women needed a dowry, items they'd bring to the marriage like linens, pots, maybe a bit of money if their family had any. Marriages were economic partnerships as much as romantic ones. You married someone who could help you survive. Love might develop, or it might not, but either way, you were stuck with each other because divorce wasn't really an option. The church allowed annulments in very specific circumstances, like if the marriage had never been consummated or if you discovered your spouse was your close relative. But generally, marriage was for life. Children started working young, as we've mentioned. By age 5 or 6, they'd be helping with small tasks. Gathering kindling, watching babies, scaring birds from the fields, fetching water. By 10 or 12, they'd be doing real work, learning their parents' trade or being sent out as apprentices or servants. Childhood as a separate life stage didn't really exist. You were a small, useless human until you were big enough to be useful, and then you worked. Education was rare unless you were wealthy or being trained for the church. Literacy was probably around 10 to 20% of the population, concentrated among clergy, nobility, and wealthy merchants. Most people never learned to read or write and didn't need to. Their knowledge was practical and oral, passed down through demonstration and memory. If a boy was sent to become a monk, which happened if his family couldn't support him or wanted to earn spiritual merit, he'd go to a monastery and learn to read and write Latin. He'd copy manuscripts, attend services 8 times a day, and live a life of prayer and labor. Monasteries were strange places, quiet and orderly in theory, though monks were human and there was plenty of gossip and petty politics and rule-breaking behind the scenes. Nuns lived similar lives in convents, though they had even fewer opportunities than monks. Some convents were for wealthy women who didn't want to marry or whose families put them there. These women might live quite comfortably, with servants and private rooms and relatively pleasant lives. Other convents were austere places where women worked hard and lived simply and prayed constantly. The church owned a huge amount of land and wealth. Monasteries and bishops controlled estates that were managed like any noble's property. They had tenants and serfs working the land, producing income that supported the religious institution. This created a weird situation where men who'd taken vows of poverty were managing large economic enterprises. The contradiction was not lost on critics, even in medieval times. Entertainment in medieval times was mostly things we'd find incredibly boring now. Watching animals, listening to stories, singing songs, going to church festivals. There was no TV, no phones, no books for most people. Entertainment was social and local, and often tied to religious holidays. Festivals were a big deal. Saints' days, harvest festivals, Christmas, Easter. These were times when you'd take a break from work and actually have some fun. There'd be feasting if you could afford it, meaning you'd eat better food than usual. Meat pies, roasted meat if someone had slaughtered an animal, ale flowing more freely than normal. You'd dress in your best clothes, which weren't great, but were at least cleaner than your work clothes. Dancing was popular, and medieval dancing was group dancing, everyone in circles or lines, doing simple steps to music played on instruments like bagpipes, drums, and fiddles. It wasn't formal ballroom dancing, it was folk dancing, energetic and communal. People would dance for hours, especially young people, because it was one of the few socially acceptable ways to be close to potential romantic partners. Music was everywhere, or at least everywhere that people weren't actively working. Traveling musicians would go from town to town, playing for coins or food. They'd sing songs that told stories, love ballads, funny songs about cuckolded husbands or foolish priests. These songs were how news and stories spread, because most people couldn't read, but they could remember a catchy tune. Storytelling was another form of entertainment. In the evenings, people would gather, and someone would tell stories. Fairy tales, legends about local heroes, religious stories, tales about King Arthur or Charlemagne. These stories were elaborate and long, and often scary, full of monsters and magic and moral lessons. Oral tradition kept them alive and constantly evolving. Mystery plays were performed by guilds in larger towns, especially during religious festivals. These were dramatizations of Bible stories, performed in marketplaces or churchyards. They were one of the few forms of theater available, and they were popular because they combined religion with entertainment. The plays could be pretty elaborate, with costumes and props and special effects like fake blood or a devil character who'd try to steal souls while the audience jeered and threw things. Gambling was popular despite being officially frowned upon by the church. People would bet on dice games, card games, animal fights. Cockfighting and bear baiting were common entertainments where you'd watch animals fight, often to the death, and bet on the outcome. It seems cruel to us now, and it was, but medieval people had a different relationship with animal suffering. Animals were resources and entertainment, and their pain wasn't given much thought. Sports existed, though they were rough and often dangerous. Football was played, but medieval football was barely regulated chaos. Two villages would compete, trying to get a ball from one end of town to the other, and there were almost no rules. It was more like a riot than a sport. People got injured, sometimes seriously, and the authorities would periodically try to ban it because it was too rowdy and people were supposed to be practicing archery instead. Archery practice was legally required for men in England because the longbow was a crucial military weapon and you needed a lifetime of practice to use it effectively. Men were supposed to practice at the butts, which were archery targets set up outside villages. In reality, enforcement was spotty, but enough people practiced that England had a formidable force of archers who could devastate enemy armies at places like Crecy and Agincourt. Hunting was a sport for the nobility, and poaching was a serious crime for everyone else. Deer, boar, and other large game animals were protected by forest law, which meant they belonged to the king or local lord, and no one else could hunt them. If you were caught poaching, you could be fined, mutilated, or killed, depending on when and where you were and how harsh the local lord was feeling. This created a weird situation where poor people were starving and surrounded by animals they couldn't legally eat. The forests were full of deer, but touching them was a crime. Rabbits and birds were sometimes allowed, though laws varied, but the good meat was off limits. Poaching happened anyway, obviously, and there was an entire underground economy of illegally hunted game being sold on the black market. Crime in general was a constant issue. Property crime, theft, robbery, assault, murder. Medieval justice was harsh and public. Punishments were designed to humiliate and hurt, to serve as warnings to others. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Leers might have their tongues cut out or be placed in the stocks or pillory, where the public could throw rotten food and insults at them for hours. The stocks locked your feet in place while you sat on the ground. The pillory locked your head and hands and forced you to stand. Both were set up in public places like market squares where everyone could see you. This was the point. Public humiliation was part of the punishment. Your neighbors would know you'd been punished, would know what you'd done, and your reputation would be destroyed. Trials were interesting because they weren't based on evidence in the way we think of it now. Witness testimony mattered, but so did your reputation and social standing. If you were a respected member of the community with people willing to vouch for you, you'd get the benefit of the doubt. If you were an outsider or someone already considered suspicious, you were probably going to be found guilty. Trial by ordeal was used for serious crimes, especially when evidence was unclear. The idea was that God would protect the innocent and reveal the guilty. You might have to carry a hot iron bar, and then your hand would be bandaged and checked a few days later. If it was healing cleanly, you were innocent. If it was infected, you were guilty. or you'd be thrown into water. And if you floated, you were guilty because pure water rejected sinners. But if you sank, you were innocent. They'd pull you out before you drowned, theoretically. These ordeals seem insane to us, but they were based on the medieval worldview where God was actively involved in human affairs and would provide justice. The funny thing is that ordeal by fire probably had a decent success rate, because priests would often apply herbal ointments to the burn that helped it heal, effectively deciding who passed the ordeal based on who they believed was innocent. Trial by combat was another option for serious disputes. Two parties would fight, and whoever won was considered to have right on their side, because God would grant victory to the just. You could hire a champion to fight for you if you were wealthy, which meant justice could literally be bought. This system heavily favored people with money and fighting skills, and it was less about truth than about who was stronger or could afford a better fighter. Prisons existed but weren't used the way we use them now. You didn't go to prison as punishment. You went there while awaiting trial or execution. Punishment was physical, quick, and public. Whipping, branding, mutilation, hanging. The death penalty was used liberally for crimes we'd consider relatively minor now. Stealing a sheep could get you hanged if the local authorities were feeling strict. Hanging was the common method of execution for commoners. Nobles might be beheaded, which was considered more honorable and quicker. Burning at the stake was reserved for heretics, and sometimes witches, though witch hunts were more of a late medieval and early modern thing. The medieval period had some witch accusations, but the full-blown witch craze came later. Public executions were events that drew crowds. People would come to watch, bring their children, treat it like entertainment. The condemned would sometimes give a speech, warning others not to follow their path to crime. The body would be left hanging as a warning, sometimes for days, until it was cut down and buried in unhallowed ground, because criminals weren't allowed proper Christian burial. Life was cheap in some ways. Violence was common, and people saw death regularly. Infant mortality, childhood disease, accidents, violence, executions. You'd see dead bodies, you'd attend funerals. Death was a constant presence. This didn't mean people didn't mourn or care, but it meant that death was normalized in a way we'd find disturbing. Medieval people believed in a vivid afterlife. Heaven and hell were real places you'd go based on your behavior in life. Purgatory was the in-between place where most people would go to be purified, before entering heaven. The length of time in purgatory depended on your sins and could be reduced by prayers from the living, masses said in your name, and indulgences purchased from the church. Indulgences were basically get-out-of-purgatory tickets. You'd pay the church money or do certain religious acts, and in return, you'd get time knocked off your sentence in purgatory. This became a huge business for the church and was one of the things that eventually led to the Reformation, when critics pointed out that selling salvation seemed contrary to Christian teaching. Funerals were important social events. The body would be washed and wrapped in a shroud, or if you were wealthy, placed in a coffin. The priest would perform a funeral mass, and you'd be buried in the churchyard, hopefully in consecrated ground. Where you were buried mattered. Closer to the church was better, inside the church itself was best, but that was only for the very wealthy or important. Your social status followed you even into death. Graveyards were reused constantly because space was limited. After enough years, old graves would be dug up, the bones moved to a charnel house, and new bodies buried in the same spot. Charnel houses were buildings filled with stacked bones from old burials, skulls and femurs arranged in decorative patterns sometimes. It was a reminder of mortality. Remember that you will die. A message the church really wanted to drive home. Ghost stories were popular, probably because death was so present. People believed in ghosts, spirits of the dead who couldn't rest because of unfinished business or improper burial. These ghosts were often scary, vengeful things that would haunt the living until their problems were resolved. Stories about ghosts served as moral lessons about the importance of proper burial rites and settling debts before death. The line between the living and the dead felt thinner in medieval times. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day were times when the veil between worlds was believed to be especially thin, and people would pray for the dead, light candles, and leave offerings. This wasn't quite ancestor worship, but it was close, a way of maintaining connection with those who'd passed on. Let's drift back to the world of work, because we've barely scratched the surface of all the jobs that kept medieval society functioning. There were so many specialized trades, each one requiring years of training and producing something that people needed, but couldn't make themselves. Potters made everything from simple cooking pots to fancy decorated jugs. They'd dig clay from local deposits, clean it, wedge it to remove air bubbles, then shape it on a wheel or by hand. The pottery wheel was foot-powered. You'd kick a heavy wheel to keep it spinning while shaping the clay. It required a steady hand and a good sense of the clay's properties. Too wet and it would collapse, too dry and it would crack. After shaping, pots had to dry slowly to avoid cracking. Then they'd be fired in a kiln. Kilns were basically large ovens that got insanely hot, hot enough to turn clay hard and waterproof. You'd stack the pottery inside carefully, build a fire, and tend it for hours to maintain the right temperature. If the temperature fluctuated too much, everything would crack or explode. A bad firing could wipe out days or weeks of work. Glazes came later in the medieval period, especially for fancier pottery. You'd coat the pottery with a mixture containing minerals that would melt and form a glassy surface when fired. This made pots waterproof and easier to clean. Plus they looked nice. Different minerals produced different colors. Lead glazes were common and produced a nice clear or yellow glaze, but they were also toxic, which no one really understood at the time. Rope makers were essential because rope was used for everything. Tying things down, pulling things, rigging ships, drawing water from wells, you name it. Making rope meant twisting fibers together, usually hemp or flax, into increasingly thick cords. You'd start with loose fibers, spin them into thread, twist threads into cord, twist cords into rope. The longer the rope needed to be, the more space you needed. So rope makers often worked in long, narrow sheds called rope walks. The work was repetitive and hard on the hands. You'd be constantly twisting and feeding fibers, walking backward as the rope lengthened, maintaining even tension so the rope would be strong and consistent. A weak spot would cause the rope to snap under load, which could be dangerous if it was holding something heavy or keeping a ship secured. Chandlers made candles, which were the main source of light after dark. Candles were expensive because they required tallow or beeswax. Tallow was rendered animal fat, usually from cattle or sheep, and it was cheaper but smelled bad when burning and produced a lot of smoke. Beeswax was more expensive, but burned cleaner and smelled better, so it was used in churches and by wealthy people. Making tallow candles meant melting the fat, dipping a wick repeatedly until enough tallow built up to form a candle, then hanging it to cool and harden. You'd have rows of wicks hanging, and you'd go down the line dipping each one, then start over at the beginning once they'd hardened a bit. It was tedious work in a workshop that smelled like hot animal fat. Beeswax candles could be dipped the same way or made in molds. Molds produced more consistent candles, but required more equipment. Either way, candle making was a skilled trade, because getting the wick size right was important. Too thick and the candle would burn too fast and drip excessively. Too thin, and the flame would be weak. Most people couldn't afford many candles, so they made do with rush lights. These were rushes, the plant that grew in wet areas, dipped in fat and then burned. They provided dim, flickering light and didn't last long, maybe an hour per rush, but they were cheap to make yourself. You'd dry the rushes, peel them partially so just a thin strip of green skin held the pith together, then dip them in waste fat, or grease, that wasn't good for anything else. Glass makers were rarer and more specialized, because glass was expensive. Sand and other ingredients had to be heated to extreme temperatures, around 1400 degrees Celsius, which required special furnaces and a lot of fuel. The molten glass would be blown, shaped, or cast into various items. Window glass was especially valuable, so valuable that wealthy people would sometimes take their window glass with them when they moved. Most windows didn't have glass. They had wooden shutters that you'd close at night to keep out the cold and bugs, though this also blocked all light. So you'd choose between being able to see and being cold, or being warm and sitting in the dark. Some people used oiled parchment or thin horn as a kind of translucent window covering that let in some light while blocking wind, but it wasn't very effective. Glass beakers, bottles, and decorative items were luxury goods. If you owned glass items, you were wealthy and wanted people to know it. Glass was fragile and had to be treated carefully, which made it impractical for everyday use for most people. They stuck with pottery and wooden containers. Coopers made barrels, and barrels were essential for storing and transporting everything from ale to salted fish to grain. Making a barrel required skill because the wooden staves had to be shaped precisely so they'd fit together without gaps. You'd cut staves from oak or other suitable wood, shape them with a draw knife and plane, then assemble them using metal hoops to hold everything tight. A well-made barrel was waterproof and sturdy enough to be rolled around or stacked. Coopers had to know how to make different sizes and shapes for different purposes. Small barrels for ale, larger barrels for wine, wide shallow barrels for salted meat. The work was physical and required precision, and a good cooper could charge decent prices for their work. Wheelwrights made wheels for carts and wagons, which doesn't sound complicated until you realize that medieval wheels had to be strong enough to handle rough roads and heavy loads while being made entirely of wood and metal. The hub, spokes, and rim all had to be fitted together perfectly, and the metal tire had to be shaped and shrunk onto the rim while hot so it would tighten as it cooled. A poorly made wheel would break under stress, which could destroy a cart and its contents or even injure people. So wheelwrights were valued craftsmen who served an essential function in a society where carts and wagons were the only way to move heavy goods over land. Saddlers and harness makers produced the leather goods needed to control and ride horses. Saddles, bridles, reins, stirrups, everything that interfaced between human and horse. This required leather working skills and understanding of how horses moved and behaved. A poorly fitted saddle would hurt the horse and make riding miserable. Good saddles were expensive and would last for years if maintained. Horses were valuable animals, work horses especially. They could pull plows and carts, could be ridden for travel or warfare. But they were expensive to keep, requiring a lot of food and care. Only people with means could afford to own and maintain horses. Oxen were more common for agricultural work because they were slower but stronger and ate less. Farriers shod horses, putting iron shoes on their hooves to protect them from wear. This required knowing how to trim hooves properly and forge shoes that fit correctly. The farrier would heat the iron shoe, shape it to match the hoof, then nail it on using special nails that went through the insensitive part of the hoof wall. Done wrong, this could lame a horse. Done right, it protected the hooves and allowed horses to work on hard surfaces. Locksmiths made locks and keys, which became more important as wealth increased and people had things worth stealing. Early medieval locks were simple, but by the late medieval period, you had complex mechanisms with multiple bolts and wards. Making a lock required precision metalwork, filing and fitting tiny parts that had to work together smoothly. Keys were large and ornate, often worn on belts as a sign of authority and responsibility. If you held the keys, you controlled access. Housewives held the keys to storerooms and chests. Jailers held the keys to cells. The symbolism of keys was powerful, representing control and trust. Bookmakers, or stationers, produced the books that did exist, and this was an incredibly labor-intensive process. Books were handwritten on parchment or vellum, which was prepared animal skin. Making parchment meant cleaning, stretching, and scraping animal skins until they were thin and smooth enough to write on. It took multiple skins to make a single book, and the whole process was time-consuming and expensive. Scribes would copy text by hand, letter by letter, often spending months or years on a single large book. Religious texts were the most common. Bibles and prayer books and theological writings. Monastic scriptoriums were the main producers of books, with monks spending their days bent over desks in cold rooms, copying by dim light, their hands cramping and eyes straining. Illuminated manuscripts with decorated letters and illustrations were works of art. The illuminators would add gold leaf, vibrant pigments made from expensive materials like lapis lazuli or cochineal, intricate designs that filled margins and transformed pages into beautiful objects. These books were treasures worth fortunes, and were often chained to desks in libraries to prevent theft. Ink was made from various materials, most commonly oak galls, mixed with iron salts and gum arabic. Oak galls are growths on oak trees caused by wasp larvae, and they contain tannic acid that reacts with iron to produce a dark, permanent ink. Making ink was a messy process, and scribes would mix their own as needed. Quill pens were the writing instruments, made from bird feathers, usually goose feathers. The end of the quill would be cut at an angle and split slightly to hold ink. Quills wore out quickly and had to be recut frequently, so scribes always had a knife handy for trimming their pens. The knife also served to scrape away mistakes, since you couldn't just erase ink. Mistakes in manuscripts were common, and sometimes the scribe would add a note in the margin apologizing for an error or complaining about the cold or their sore hand. These marginal notes give us glimpses into the personalities of medieval scribes, who were human and bored and tired, just like anyone doing repetitive work for hours on end. Let's talk more about clothing, because what people wore in medieval times was both simpler and more complicated than you'd think. The basic garment for both men and women was a tunic, basically a long shirt that reached to the knees or ankles, depending on your gender and social class. Women wore theirs long, men wore theirs shorter if they were working class, longer if they were wealthy or elderly. Under the tunic you'd wear a linen undergarment called a shift or chemise. This was next to your skin and would be washed more frequently than outer clothes, which is why linen was used, because it was easier to clean than wool. The shift absorbed sweat and body oils, protecting your outer clothes from getting quite as disgusting quite as fast. Over the tunic, you might wear a sleeveless overdress or surcoat, depending on the period and your social class. Women would wear aprons when working to protect their clothes. Men would wear hose, basically tight leggings that covered each leg separately and were tied to a belt or to the tunic itself. Before elastic was invented, everything had to be tied or pinned or laced. Shoes were simple leather affairs, often just a piece of leather shaped around the foot and tied on. They wore out quickly and were expensive to replace, so poor people would go barefoot when they could, especially in summer. Wooden clogs or pattens could be worn over shoes to protect them from mud and keep your feet out of the worst of the street filth. Hats were common because they protected you from sun and rain. Men wore caps or hoods. Women wore veils or wimples that covered their hair, because married women covering their hair was a sign of modesty and respectability. Young unmarried women could wear their hair loose or in braids, but once you were married, you covered up. The amount of fabric in your clothes indicated your wealth. Rich people wore clothes with lots of fabric, long trailing sleeves, elaborate folds and pleats. This was conspicuous consumption, showing that you could afford to waste fabric on decoration. Poor people wore clothes that used the minimum amount of fabric necessary and were designed for function, not fashion. Colors also indicated wealth. Bright, vivid colors came from expensive dyes. Poor people wore clothes in shades of brown, gray, and undyed wool colors. The wealthy wore reds, blues, greens, and the ultra-expensive purple. Sumptuary laws in some places even regulated what colors and fabrics different social classes could wear, to prevent people from dressing above their station. Keeping clothes clean was a challenge. You couldn't just throw them in a washing machine. Large items would be taken to a stream or river and beaten with rocks or paddles to knock the dirt out, then rinsed and laid out to dry. This was hard work and wore out the fabric, so you didn't do it often. Smaller items might be boiled in a pot with soap, then wrung out and dried. Soap was made from wood ash lye and animal fat, a process that produced a harsh soap that cleaned effectively but was rough on both fabric and skin. Commercial soap makers existed in towns, but many people made their own. The process involved carefully mixing lye with fat and boiling it until it saponified, or turned into soap. Get the ratios wrong, and you'd end up with a caustic mess that didn't clean anything. Sewing and mending were constant tasks. Clothes wore out, ripped, developed holes, and had to be repaired to make them last as long as possible. Women would spend evenings sewing by firelight or candlelight, which was hard on the eyes but necessary. Thread was expensive, needles were expensive, everything was expensive, so you took care of your things. Needles were made of bone, bronze, or iron, and they had to be carefully maintained because a broken needle was a real loss. The eye of the needle had to be smooth, or it would shred the thread. Women would keep their needles stuck in a piece of cloth or leather to protect them, and losing your needle was a minor disaster. Buttons weren't common until later in the medieval period. Clothes were fastened with ties, pins, or brooches. Pins were often made of wood or bone, metal pins being more expensive. Brooches could be quite elaborate for the wealthy, made of gold or silver with precious stones, serving both as fasteners and as jewelry and displays of wealth. Now let's talk about travel, because moving from one place to another in medieval times was difficult, dangerous, and slow. If you were a peasant, you probably never traveled more than a few miles from where you were born. Your entire world was your village and maybe the nearest market town. You'd hear stories about other places, but you'd never see them. If you did have to travel, you walked. Horses and carts were for people with money. Walking 5 or 10 miles would take hours. A full day's journey might be 20 to 30 miles if you were young and healthy and the roads were good. But roads were often terrible, especially in bad weather, so actual travel speeds were slower. Highways, such as they were, connected major towns and cities. These were maintained to varying degrees depending on local resources and priorities. Some roads were paved or cobbled in towns, but most were just dirt tracks that turned to mud when it rained. Ruts from cart wheels would form and make the road uneven and difficult. In very wet periods, roads could become completely impassable. Rivers were actually better for transport than roads in many cases. Boats and barges could carry heavy loads more easily than carts, and waterways didn't turn to mud. Of course, you were at the mercy of currents, winds, and the fact that rivers didn't necessarily go where you wanted to go. But major rivers had a lot of traffic, with goods being moved up and down by boat. Bridges were important and often scarce. Crossing a river might mean using a bridge if there was one, or a ferry if there wasn't. Ferries were boats that would take people and carts across for a fee. They were dangerous because medieval boats were small and rivers could be treacherous. People drowned in ferry accidents regularly. Bridges were expensive to build and maintain, so they were often paid for by tolls. You'd pay a small fee to cross, which went toward keeping the bridge repaired. Some bridges were built and maintained by religious orders or wealthy benefactors as acts of charity. Building a bridge was seen as a pious act because it helped travelers, including pilgrims. Pilgrimage was a major reason for travel in medieval times. People would journey to holy sites, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to visit the tomb of a saint or a place associated with a miracle. This was partly religious devotion and partly tourism, a chance to see the world beyond your village. Pilgrims would travel in groups for safety, staying at monasteries or pilgrims' hostels along the way. The journey itself was seen as spiritually valuable, a form of penance or devotion. You'd be leaving your normal life, facing hardship and danger, relying on the charity of others. The experience was meant to be transformative. Of course, some people probably just enjoyed the adventure and the excuse to get away from home for a while. Famous pilgrimage sites like Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or Rome and Jerusalem drew thousands of pilgrims. The roads to these sites had infrastructure built up around them, inns and markets catering to travelers. Locals would sell badges and souvenirs to pilgrims, little lid or pewter tokens that proved you'd been there. Pilgrims wore special clothing, often including a hat with a wide brim, a staff for walking, and a bag or scrip for carrying supplies. They have a cockleshell badge if they'd been to Santiago de Compostela, a palm frond if they'd been to Jerusalem. These symbols identified you as a pilgrim and theoretically offered some protection, as robbing a pilgrim was considered especially sinful. Of course, not everyone respected the sanctity of pilgrims. Bandits would still rob them, innkeepers would overcharge them, and fellow travelers might steal from them. The roads were dangerous, and being on a religious journey didn't make you immune to the usual risks of medieval travel. Crusades were a form of armed pilgrimage, where you traveled to the Holy Land not just to visit, but to fight to reclaim it from Muslim control. Thousands of people went on crusades, from knights and nobles to poor peasants hoping for salvation and adventure. The journey to the Holy Land took months, traveling overland through Europe, and then by ship across the Mediterranean if you survived disease, bandits, hostile armies, and the general hazards of medieval travel. Crusaders faced unimaginable hardships. They'd be away from home for years, many died of disease or in battle, and even those who survived often came back broke and traumatized. But the idea of fighting for God and earning spiritual merit was powerful, and crusading became a major feature of medieval culture for several centuries. For people who weren't pilgrims or crusaders, long-distance travel was usually for trade. Merchants would travel between cities, buying and selling goods, as we've discussed. They'd have more resources than pilgrims, but they also had to worry about their goods being stolen or damaged. A merchant's wealth was tied up in the items they were transporting, so losing a shipment could be financially ruinous. Sea travel was faster than land travel, but more dangerous. Ships were small, navigation was primitive, and storms could sink you without warning. The Mediterranean was relatively well-traveled and had ports where you could stop, but the Atlantic and North Sea were more treacherous. Viking raiders had been a threat earlier in the medieval period, and even later, pirates and storms made sea travel risky. Sailors were a distinct group, often looked down on by people who lived on land. They worked incredibly hard, hauling ropes and sails, climbing masts in all weather, living on ships that were cramped and wet and uncomfortable. Their diet at sea was terrible, mostly salt meat and hard bread that often had weevils. Scurvy was a problem on long voyages because they had no fresh vegetables or fruit. Fishing was a major industry in coastal areas. Fish was an important part of the medieval diet, especially on Fridays and during Lent when meat was forbidden by the church. Fishermen would go out in small boats, cast nets, and bring back whatever they caught. Herring, cod, and other fish would be salted or dried to preserve them and then transported inland. The dried cod trade was especially important in Northern Europe. Cod from the North Atlantic would be dried until it was hard as wood, then could be stored and transported for months. It wasn't delicious, but it was protein and it kept, which made it valuable. Rehydrating and cooking dried cod was a lengthy process, soaking it for days to remove the salt and make it edible again. Let's drift into the less pleasant aspects of medieval life, specifically health and disease, because medieval people were sick a lot and medicine was mostly useless. Life expectancy was low, not just because of infant mortality, but because illness and injury could kill you at any age. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germs, no effective treatments for most diseases. Common ailments that we barely notice today could be fatal. An infected cut could lead to blood poisoning and death. A bad tooth abscess could spread to your jaw and kill you. Pneumonia, influenza, and other respiratory infections were major killers, especially in winter when people were crowded indoors in poorly ventilated spaces, breathing each other's germs. Tuberculosis was rampant, called consumption because it seemed to consume people from within. They'd waste away over months or years, coughing blood, until they died. It was contagious, but no one knew that, so people would share beds and living spaces with consumptive family members, and then catch it themselves. Entire families would be wiped out. Leprosy was terrifying and not as uncommon as you might think. Lepers were outcasts, forced to live in leprosariums or leper colonies outside of towns. They had to ring bells to warn people they were approaching, wear special clothing to identify themselves, and were forbidden from touching healthy people. The disease was thought to be divine punishment for sin, which added moral stigma to physical suffering. In reality, leprosy wasn't as contagious as people feared, but the stigma was devastating. Being diagnosed with leprosy meant losing your family, your home, your identity. You'd be declared legally dead and sent away, forced to beg for survival. Some leprosariums were run by religious orders and provided decent care, but others were basically prisons where the diseased were warehoused until they died. Plague was the big one, the Black Death that killed a third to half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. It came in waves, recurring every few generations, and it was absolutely terrifying. Bubonic plague caused swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes, fever, and often death within days. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs and spread even more quickly, killing almost everyone who contracted it. No one understood what caused plague. Theories included bad air, divine punishment, alignment of planets, Jews poisoning wells. The Jewish community was often scapegoated and faced horrific persecution during plague outbreaks. Pogroms would kill thousands of innocent people based on conspiracy theories and fear. The actual cause, bacteria spread by fleas on rats, wouldn't be discovered for centuries. In the meantime, people tried various preventatives and treatments, all useless. Prayers, flagellation, quarantine, burning aromatic herbs, wearing plague masks with long beaks stuffed with spices. None of it worked. You either survived plague or you didn't, and survival was mostly luck. During plague outbreaks, the social fabric would break down. People would flee cities, abandoning sick family members. Bodies would pile up because there weren't enough people to bury them all. Mass graves were dug and filled with corpses. Survivors would inherit property from dead relatives, which sometimes meant plague had a silver lining for those who lived, but only after experiencing unimaginable trauma. The economic effects of plague were significant. With so many workers dead, labor was suddenly valuable. Peasants could demand higher wages or better conditions, because lords needed workers and couldn't get them easily. This led to social tensions and eventually peasant revolts in some places when authorities tried to suppress wages and keep the old feudal system going. Other diseases were less dramatic but still miserable. Dysentery from contaminated water and food was common, causing severe diarrhea that could lead to fatal dehydration. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water, caused high fever and could kill. Measles, mumps, smallpox, all childhood diseases that killed many children before they reached adulthood. Smallpox was particularly nasty, causing high fever and painful pustules all over the body. Many people died, and survivors were often left scarred and sometimes blind. Smallpox didn't care about your social class. It killed rich and poor alike. There's a grim historical litany of important people who died of smallpox or were left disfigured by it. Malnutrition made everything worse. When you're not getting enough calories or the right nutrients, your immune system doesn't work properly. Medieval peasants often lived on the edge of starvation, especially in winter and early spring when food stores ran low. Diseases that might have been survivable with proper nutrition could be fatal when you were already weakened by hunger. Ergot poisoning was a weird one caused by fungus growing on rye grain. If you ate bread made from contaminated rye, you'd experience hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene in the extremities, and sometimes death. Outbreaks of ergot poisoning might explain some of the stranger historical events, like people dancing uncontrollably or seeing visions, but it was just a toxic mold on moldy grain. Parasites were universal. Intestinal worms, lice, fleas, bedbugs, everyone had them. You'd take herbal purgatives to try to expel intestinal worms, which sometimes worked but was unpleasant. Lice were controlled by combing, and sometimes by harsh treatments like applying mercury, which could be worse than the lice. Fleas and bedbugs were just part of life. You lived with itching and the risk of diseases they carried. Bathing was infrequent, as mentioned earlier, but people did try to stay clean in other ways. Changing your undergarments regularly, if you had more than one set, helped. Using scented herbs and perfumes covered up odors. Combing and caring for your hair and beard removed some dirt and parasites. But compared to modern standards, everyone was filthy. Dental health was poor. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dental care, teeth rotted and caused constant pain. People would clean their teeth by chewing on twigs that frayed into fibers, which helped a bit, or rubbing them with cloth and various pastes made from herbs. But decay was inevitable, and once a tooth started hurting badly, your only option was to have it pulled. Pain management was primitive. Alcohol could dull pain to some degree, and opium was available but expensive. Most people just suffered. You'd get used to chronic pain, from bad teeth or arthritis or old injuries that never healed properly. Pain was just part of life, and you dealt with it because there was no choice. Injuries were common in a world full of physical labor and sharp tools. Cuts, burns, broken bones, crushed limbs from accidents with heavy equipment or farm animals. Many injuries healed badly or not at all. A broken bone might be set by someone with experience, or it might heal crooked and leave you permanently disabled. Amputation was sometimes necessary for crushed or badly infected limbs, and it was done without anesthetic, just alcohol and people holding you down while someone sawed through bone. Infection was the biggest risk after injury. Without understanding of antiseptic techniques, wounds would often become infected. Pus was actually seen as a good sign, laudable pus, because physicians thought it meant the wound was healing. In reality, it meant bacteria were thriving. Many people died of infections from relatively minor wounds. Childbirth, as mentioned, was incredibly dangerous for women. If labor went wrong, if the baby was positioned badly, or the placenta didn't deliver properly, or the mother hemorrhaged, she could die. The baby could die too, or be born alive but damaged from a difficult birth. And even if everything went well, postnatal infections could kill the mother days or weeks later. Women would be attended by midwives and female relatives during labor. Men were generally not present. This was women's business. The midwife would have experience and traditional knowledge, but not much she could do if complications arose. Sometimes a surgeon might be called if the baby needed to be removed to save the mother, but this usually meant the baby would die if it hadn't already. Caesarean sections were performed in extreme circumstances, usually when the mother was dying or already dead, and there was a chance of saving the baby. The surgery was essentially a death sentence for the mother in medieval times, because the surgical techniques and infection control needed for her to survive didn't exist. Mental illness was poorly understood and frightening to medieval people. Severe mental illness might be attributed to demonic possession, leading to exorcism attempts or even violence against the afflicted person. Milder forms of mental illness might be tolerated or ignored, or the person might be cared for by family, or they might end up homeless and begging. Epilepsy was thought to be caused by demons or an imbalance of humors. During seizures, people might try to hold the person down or put things in their mouth, which could cause injury. Some epileptics were believed to have prophetic abilities or special spiritual insight, so the condition had complex social meanings. Aging was difficult because of the accumulated effects of a hard life. People who survived to old age, which would be their 50s or 60s, often had bodies wrecked by decades of labor. Arthritis, vision problems, hearing loss, missing teeth, chronic pain from old injuries, all of this was normal for older people. And without social security or pensions, elderly people relied on family or charity to survive once they couldn't work anymore. Widows and orphans were particularly vulnerable. A woman who lost her husband lost her main source of support. If she was young with children, she'd try to remarry quickly. If she was older, she might move in with adult children or rely on the church for charity. Orphan children might be taken in by relatives, or they might end up as servants or apprentices, or in the worst cases, as beggars or street children. The church provided some social safety net through charity, giving food and money to the poor, running hospitals and almshouses for the sick and elderly. Monasteries and convents were obligated to provide hospitality to travelers and alms to the needy. But resources were limited, and there were far more people in need than there was charity to go around. Hospitals existed, but they weren't like modern hospitals. They were more like hospices or hostels for the sick and poor, places to rest and receive basic care, but not much treatment. The idea was to provide comfort and spiritual care, not cure illness. Hospital attendants might clean patients, provide food, change bandages, but they couldn't actually fix most medical problems. The belief that illness was punishment for sin or a test from God meant that suffering had spiritual meaning. You were supposed to endure it patiently, offer your pain to God, and hope for heaven as a reward. This provided some psychological comfort, but didn't ease the physical suffering. Now let's drift over to the nobility and wealthy merchants, because their lives were different, though maybe not as different as you'd expect. They had more money, better houses, better food, and didn't have to do physical labor themselves. But they were still living in medieval times with all the limitations that implied. Noble houses were larger and made of stone instead of wattle and daub, which was a significant improvement. Stone didn't burn as easily, though it was cold and damp. Castles were the ultimate noble residence, built for defense with thick walls, towers, and narrow windows that kept out arrows but also light and air. Living in a castle meant living in a drafty, dark, cold pile of stone that was defensible but not comfortable. Heating a castle was nearly impossible. You'd have fireplaces in the main rooms, but heat didn't spread far in vast stone spaces. Tapestries hung on walls helped insulate and block drafts, but winters in castles were miserable. Everyone would huddle near the fires, and sleeping in a cold stone bedroom meant piling on furs and blankets and still being cold. The Great Hall was the center of castle life, a large room where the lord would eat, conduct business, and entertain guests. Everyone ate together in the hall, at least in theory. The lord and his family would sit at a high table on a raised platform, and retainers, servants, and guests would sit at lower tables. Your position in the hall reflected your social status, with distance from the lord indicating your rank. Meals for the nobility were more elaborate than peasant fare, but still limited by medieval food preservation techniques. They'd have multiple courses, including meat which peasants rarely ate. Venison, pork, beef, mutton, poultry, fish, all served in various preparations. Sauces and spices were used liberally, partly for flavor, but also to cover up the taste of meat that was starting to spoil. Medieval feasts were displays of wealth and power. You'd serve an excessive amount of food, more than anyone could possibly eat, and what was left over would be distributed to servants and the poor. The feast itself was as much about the spectacle as the eating. Elaborate dishes, musicians playing, entertainment between courses. A whole roasted peacock with its feathers reattached for presentation. A pie that when cut open released live birds. Subtleties, which were sculptural food displays made from sugar or marzipan. Table manners were important and increasingly codified. You'd wash your hands before eating, because you ate with your hands. Forks weren't used until later, so you'd use your knife to cut meat and your fingers to eat. There were rules about not picking your teeth at the table, not wiping your greasy hands on your clothes, not talking with your mouth full. Etiquette books began to appear, teaching people how to behave properly. Trenchers were used as plates, thick slices of stale bread that would absorb juices from the food. After the meal, the trenchers would be given to the poor, so they'd eat bread soaked in meat drippings, which was probably better than what they usually ate. Wealthier people might have wooden or metal plates, but trenchers were common at large feasts. Wine was the drink of choice for the wealthy, while commoners drank ale. Wine had to be imported in Northern Europe, making it expensive and prestigious. The quality varied wildly, and bad wine could be vinegary or infected with bacteria. but good wine from France or the Mediterranean was prized. Ale was seen as a lower-class drink, though nobles drank it too when wine wasn't available. Clothing for the nobility was made from finer materials, silk imported from the East or finely woven wool from Flanders. They'd have multiple outfits and could afford to change clothes regularly. The cut and style of noble clothing was more complex, with elaborate sleeves, trains on gowns, and accessories like belts and jewelry that indicated status. Jewelry was a form of wealth storage as well as decoration. Rings, brooches, necklaces made from gold and set with precious stones. These could be worn to display wealth or sold in an emergency. Noble women especially would have jewelry as part of their dowry, items that were theirs to keep even if the marriage fell apart. Education for noble children was more extensive than for peasants. Sons would learn to read and write, usually in Latin as well as the vernacular. They'd study history, theology, law, and the arts of war. Daughters would learn reading, writing, music, needlework, and household management. The goal was to prepare them for their roles as lords and ladies, managing estates and households. Noble boys would become pages around age 7, sent to another noble household to learn service and courtly manners. Around 14, they'd become squires, serving a knight and learning the skills of warfare. Riding, swordsmanship, archery, the care of armor and weapons. At around 21, if they'd proven themselves, they'd be knighted in a ceremony that was both religious and martial. Knighthood was a big deal, a mark of status and warrior capability. Knights were supposed to follow a code of chivalry, though in practice this was often more ideal than reality. Chivalry meant bravery, loyalty, protecting the weak, respecting women, being honorable. In reality, knights were often brutal warriors who did a lot of violence and justified it with lofty ideals. Warfare was a major occupation for the nobility. Lords were expected to fight when their king or overlord called on them, bringing their knights and men-at-arms. Medieval warfare was chaotic and brutal. Battles involved masses of men fighting hand-to-hand with swords, axes, spears, and maces. Cavalry charges could break enemy lines or be stopped by dense formations of infantry. Armor evolved over the medieval period, from chainmail to plate armor. Chainmail was made from thousands of interlocking metal rings, flexible but heavy and hot to wear. It provided decent protection against cuts, but could be pierced by arrows or spear thrusts. Plate armor, which developed later, was made from shaped metal plates that covered the body, offering better protection but being even heavier and more expensive. Wearing full armor meant carrying 50 to 60 pounds of metal. You'd be hot, exhausted, and unable to move quickly. Battles fought in armor were tests of endurance as much as skill. Men would collapse from heat and exhaustion, and if you fell down, getting back up in plate armor was difficult. Knights who fell in battle might drown in mud or be killed by lightly armored infantry while they struggled to rise. Tournaments were practice for war and entertainment. Knights would compete in jousts, charging at each other with lances, trying to unhorse their opponent. It was dangerous, and men were sometimes killed or seriously injured, despite the use of blunted weapons and armor. Tournaments were also social events where nobles could display their wealth and prowess. Sieges were the most common form of warfare, because castles and walled towns were hard to take by assault. An army would surround a castle, cut off supplies, and wait for the defenders to starve or surrender. Sieges could last months. Meanwhile, the besiegers were also suffering, living in camps outside the walls, dealing with disease and supply problems of their own. Siege weapons included catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. Trebuchets could hurl massive stones that would damage walls or be launched over walls to kill defenders and destroy buildings inside. Mining was another technique, digging tunnels under walls to collapse them. Defenders would countermine, digging their own. When a castle or town was taken by storm, the attacking army often sacked it, killing, looting, and raping. The laws of war gave soldiers the right to plunder if a place was taken by force rather than surrendering. This created an incentive for defenders to hold out, and for attackers to be ruthless. Medieval warfare had rules, but they were often brutal and based on might makes right. Ransom was common for captured nobles. If you were a knight or lord and got captured in battle, you wouldn't be killed if your captor thought you were worth more alive. You'd be held for ransom, a sum of money paid by your family or lord in exchange for your freedom. This could be financially ruinous for the family, but at least the prisoner lived. Common soldiers had no such protection and would be killed or enslaved. Crusading, as mentioned earlier, was seen as a holy duty and a way to gain spiritual merit. But it was also an opportunity for second sons who would inherit land to gain wealth and status through conquest. The Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land offered new opportunities for ambitious men, though the reality of fighting in a desert against skilled enemies while far from home was harsh. The military religious orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller were monks who were also warriors. They took vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, but they fought in battles and ran a banking empire. The Templars especially became incredibly wealthy, managing money for nobles and kings, which eventually led to their downfall when the French king decided he wanted their wealth and accused them of heresy. Heresy was a serious charge in medieval times. Believing or teaching things contrary to church doctrine could get you investigated by the Inquisition, tortured to extract a confession, and burned at the stake. The church took doctrinal purity seriously, and anyone who questioned official teachings was dangerous. Heretical movements did arise, groups who believed the church was corrupt or that salvation worked differently than official teaching said. These were suppressed violently. Jews in medieval Europe faced periodic persecution. They were forbidden from many professions, couldn't own land in most places, and were often restricted to living in specific areas of towns. They could work in finance because Christians were forbidden from charging interest, though as mentioned, Christians found ways around this. The association of Jews with money lending created resentment, and during times of crisis like plagues, Jews became scapegoats. Pogroms would kill hundreds of thousands of Jews, destroying entire communities. They'd be accused of poisoning wells, ritually murdering Christian children, or other blood libels that had no basis in fact. The church officially condemned violence against Jews, but local authorities often looked the other way or participated. Jewish communities survived through resilience and mutual support, but it was a precarious existence. Let's drift into the world of monasteries, because they were important institutions in medieval society, and the people who lived in them had very different lives from everyone else we've talked about. Monasteries were religious communities where monks lived apart from the world, devoting themselves to prayer and work. The monastic day was structured around the divine office. 8 prayer services held at set times throughout the day and night. Matins at midnight or early morning, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline at night. Monks would gather in the church for each service, chanting psalms and prayers in Latin, then return to their other duties. This schedule meant monks never got a full night's sleep. They'd sleep for a few hours, wake for matins, maybe sleep again briefly, then be up for the day. It was exhausting, and the constant sleep deprivation was part of the discipline. You were supposed to be focused on God, not comfort. Between prayer services, monks worked. The Benedictine rule, which many monasteries followed, emphasized ora et labora, prayer and work. Monks would farm monastery lands, copy manuscripts in the scriptorium, care for the sick in the infirmary, teach in monastery schools, brew beer, make wine, produce goods that the monastery sold for income. Monasteries were economic enterprises as well as religious communities. They owned large estates worked by peasants and serfs, just like any lord's lands. The income supported the monks and funded the monastery's activities, including charity to the poor. Some monasteries became very wealthy, with elaborate church buildings, extensive libraries, and political influence. The abbot was the head of the monastery, elected by the monks, but often from noble families. He'd manage the monastery's properties, deal with secular authorities, and oversee the spiritual life of the community. It was a powerful position, and some abbots wielded influence comparable to bishops or secular lords. Monks took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant you owned nothing personally. Everything belonged to the community. Chastity meant no sex, no marriage, complete celibacy. Obedience meant following the rule and the orders of the abbot without question. These vows were supposed to free monks from worldly concerns and allow them to focus on spiritual matters. In practice, the level of observance varied. Some monasteries were strict, with monks living simply and following the rule closely. Others became lax, with monks living comfortably, bending the rules, sometimes openly violating their vows. Reform movements would periodically arise, trying to return monasteries to stricter observance, and for a while things would improve, then gradually slide back into laxity. The scriptorium was where manuscripts were copied, and this was tedious, difficult work. A scribe would sit at a desk in a cold room, because you didn't want fire risk near all that precious parchment, and copy text letter by letter. It took months to copy a single large book. Your hand would cramp, your back would ache, your eyes would strain in the dim light. Scribes would sometimes add notes in the margins complaining about the work. "This parchment is hairy. My hand is tired. Thank God it will soon be dark. The scribe who wrote this deserves a good dinner." These little glimpses of personality make medieval scribes feel human across the centuries. Illumination was the art of decorating manuscripts, and this required different skills from writing. Illuminators would add decorated capital letters, margin illustrations, full-page miniatures. They'd use expensive pigments, gold leaf, intricate designs that took hours of careful work. The most elaborate manuscripts were works of art as well as texts. Monastery libraries preserved knowledge through the medieval period. Ancient texts, both Christian and pagan, were copied and stored. Without monasteries, much of classical learning would have been lost. Of course, monks were selective about what they preserved, focusing on Christian texts and classical works that aligned with Christian teaching, but they still saved a lot. Education happened in monasteries and church schools, one of the few places where learning was available. Boys from wealthy families might be sent to monastery schools to learn reading, writing, theology. Some would become monks themselves. Others would return to secular life with an education that prepared them for administrative positions. Universities began to develop in the later medieval period, growing out of cathedral schools and teaching guilds. Paris, Bologna, Oxford. These early universities taught theology, law, and medicine. Students would study for years, starting with the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, then moving on to specialized fields. Student life at medieval universities was rowdy. Young men away from home, often living in boarding houses with minimal supervision, would drink, fight, chase women, and generally cause trouble. Town-gown conflicts between students and townspeople were common, sometimes escalating into actual brawls or riots. Universities had their own jurisdictions and legal protections, which frustrated townspeople who had to deal with drunk students causing problems. Back to the monastery, food was simple but adequate. Monks usually ate twice a day, after morning prayers and in the late afternoon. The meals were vegetarian, except on special occasions, because meat was seen as inflaming the passions and incompatible with spiritual life. Fish was allowed, along with eggs and cheese. Bread, vegetables, legumes, these were staples. The refectory was where monks ate together in silence, while one monk read aloud from religious texts. Eating was a communal activity, but not a social one. You'd listen to the reading, eat your simple meal, and try to think about spiritual matters rather than enjoying the food too much. Fasting was regular, especially during Lent and other penitential periods. Monks would eat less, give up certain foods, take only one meal a day. This was supposed to discipline the body and focus the mind on God. In practice, it meant being hungry a lot, and hunger is distracting, but that was part of the challenge. The infirmary cared for sick and elderly monks. Monasteries often had herb gardens where they grow medicinal plants. Monks who served in the infirmary would learn herbal medicine, treating illnesses as best they could with the limited knowledge available. The infirmary was also where elderly monks who could no longer keep up with the full schedule would live, receiving care until they died. Death in a monastery was a community event. Monks would gather, pray for the dying brother, be present as he passed. His body would be washed, dressed in his habit, and buried in the monastery cemetery. Monks would continue to pray for his soul, believing their prayers would help him through purgatory. Monasteries provided hospitality to travelers, a duty that was taken seriously. A guest house would accommodate pilgrims and other travelers, providing food and shelter usually free of charge. This was a form of charity and also a way for monasteries to engage with the wider world. Travelers would bring news, and monasteries could show their wealth and piety through generous hospitality. Some monasteries became pilgrimage destinations themselves if they possessed important relics. A bone from a saint, a piece of the true cross, some object associated with a miracle. Pilgrims would come to venerate the relic, pray for healing or favors, and leave donations. Successful pilgrimage sites could become very wealthy from pilgrim offerings. Relics were a huge business in medieval times. Pieces of saints' bodies were bought, sold, traded, and sometimes stolen. The more important the saint, the more valuable the relic. Churches competed to have the best relics because they drew pilgrims and their money. This created a market in fake relics, which was a recognized problem, though not much was done about it. Convents, the female equivalent of monasteries, followed similar rules, but had fewer opportunities. Nuns prayed, worked, and lived communally under the authority of an abbess. But women had less autonomy than men in medieval society, and convents were often under the supervision of male religious authorities. Nuns couldn't become priests, couldn't say mass, had limited roles within the church hierarchy. Still, convents offered women an alternative to marriage. If you were a woman who didn't want to marry, or whose family couldn't or wouldn't arrange a marriage, becoming a nun was one of few respectable options. Some women genuinely felt a religious calling. Others used the convent as a way to have some independence and education. Some nuns were mystics, women who claimed direct spiritual experiences and visions. Hildegard of Bingen was a nun who wrote theology, music, and natural philosophy, claiming divine inspiration. Julian of Norwich experienced visions and wrote about them. These women gained influence and respect through their spiritual authority, though they were always operating within a male-dominated structure. The church controlled marriage, birth, death, and most aspects of daily life. Its calendar structured the year. Its rituals marked life stages. Its teachings shaped how people understood the world. Bishops and archbishops wielded political power alongside secular lords. The Pope was a major political player, able to excommunicate kings or call crusades. The Great Schism of 1054 split the Church into Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox branches, a division that persists to this day. The causes were theological and political, disputes over church authority and doctrine. For most ordinary people, this was distant politics, but it reflected broader tensions within Christendom. Later, the Western Schism from 1378 to 1417 saw multiple men claiming to be pope simultaneously, each backed by different political factions. This created confusion and undermined papal authority. Eventually, the schism was resolved, but it had damaged the church's credibility and contributed to growing criticism of church corruption. Critics of the church existed throughout the medieval period, though they had to be careful. John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus in Bohemia. They questioned church teachings and practices and faced persecution for it. Their ideas would contribute to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, but in the medieval period, they were seen as dangerous heretics. The church's wealth and power created resentment. Tithes were a burden on people who could barely feed themselves. Monasteries controlled vast lands while preaching poverty. Cardinals lived like princes. This contradiction between Christian ideals and institutional reality was obvious to many people, and criticism was common even if open rebellion was rare. Let's ease toward the end here, drifting through some final thoughts about medieval life, the way the evening light fades into night. We've covered a lot of ground walking through the daily routines of peasants and craftspeople, the struggles with disease, and the constant presence of death, the different worlds of nobles and monks, the harsh realities of medieval justice and warfare. The overwhelming impression of medieval life is that it was hard. Hard physical labor, limited food, constant illness, violence and instability, few comforts and almost no control over your circumstances. Most people were born, lived, and died within a few miles of the same place, never traveling far, never seeing much of the world beyond their village or town. But it wasn't all grim. People found joy in small things. Festivals and feast days broke up the monotony. Friendships and family bonds provided emotional support. The rhythm of the seasons and agricultural year gave structure and meaning. Faith offered hope for a better afterlife, even if this life was difficult. Medieval people weren't so different from us in their basic human needs and desires. They wanted safety, food, family, community, meaning. The circumstances they lived in were wildly different. The technology and social structures were alien to our modern perspective. But underneath, humans being human, finding ways to survive and occasionally thrive even in challenging conditions. The medieval period eventually gave way to the Renaissance and early modern era as trade increased. Cities grew, technology advanced, and ideas shifted. The Black Death ironically helped end the medieval world by killing so many people that labor became valuable and serfdom became economically unviable. The printing press democratized knowledge. Exploration opened up new worlds. The Reformation shattered church unity. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now we've spent time in the medieval world, walked its muddy streets, sat in its dark houses, worked its fields, and smelled its incredible smells. We've seen how people lived when life was short and hard, and the modern comforts we take for granted didn't exist. So let's end there with an image of a medieval evening. The sun setting over fields where peasants are finally heading home after a long day. Smoke rising from chimneys as fires are stoked for the night. The church bells ringing for vespers. People gathering in the dim light of their one-room homes, eating simple meals, maybe sharing stories or songs, before the darkness and cold send them to bed. Tomorrow they'll wake up and do it all again. The same routines, the same struggles, the same small pleasures. Day after day, season after season, generation after generation. That was medieval life. And now you know far more about it than you probably wanted to. Sleep well, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this extremely long walk through the medieval world. I hope your bed is more comfortable than a straw mattress on a dirt floor, and your dreams are free of plague and futile obligations. Until next time, fade out.